Welcome to Victor's Children, a podcast from so-called Canada talking socialism from below. My name is David Canfield. I live with my partner and cat in Winnipeg, Manitoba, which is in Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. All those of us in the Canadian state who aren't Indigenous need to commit ourselves to the struggle against settler colonialism. Victor's Children is a member of the Harbinger Media Network, a community working to promote left podcasts in Canada. Check out the list of Harbinger podcasts at harbingermedianetwork.com. Before we get to this episode, my interview with John Carlson, I should just explain that at one point, John says Coulthard, and there he's referring to Glenn Coulthard, author of the 2014 book Red Skin, White Masks, Rejecting the Colonial Politics of Recognition. In so-called Canada, for over a decade, we've seen growing attention among non-Indigenous folks to the oppression of Indigenous nations. While this is usually influenced by the ideology of reconciliation, it's also opened up space for radically questioning the social order that continues to oppress Indigenous peoples, which we often name as settler colonialism. There's also been more tension in the United States thanks to struggles such as the one at Standing Rock against the Dakota Access Pipeline. Internationally, Israel's war against Gaza has led more people to start thinking about the oppression of Palestinians in terms of settler colonialism. In so-called Canada, and probably to a lesser extent in the US, that's actually been made easier for people who already thought about the oppression of Indigenous people on Turtle Island in terms of settler colonialism. So these shifts are welcome, but what's usually missing is a solid grasp of the relationship between settler colonialism and capitalism. And that's something that non-Marxists who think about settler colonialism generally are not very interested in. And it's even rarer for people to have a good understanding of the political implications of this relationship. In other words, what it means for struggles for liberation from settler colonial capitalism. So to discuss these things from an Indigenous Marxist perspective, I'm very glad to be joined on this episode of Victor's Children by John Carlson. So John, could you start by introducing yourself to listeners?
Yes, hi everyone. Thank you for having me, David. My name is John Carlson. I'm an Anishinaabe, Kingfisher clan, and I belong to the Red Rock Indian Band. I'm also currently an assistant professor at the University of Ottawa in the Department of Criminology, and I work and live, and I'm speaking to you from unceded Algonquin Nation territory.
Thanks. So can you start us off by talking a bit about ideas around reconciliation, and sometimes we also hear decolonization used by governments, some employers, some leaders of religious institutions, NGOs, unions, and so on in so-called Canada. And in particular, what do you think reconciliation means for the sections of the ruling class that say they're in favor of it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I'll get to the last part of your question in a minute. I think reconciliation on some level, is a positive development, certainly for, the function in terms of healing for a lot of survivors of residential school and whatnot. And in that sense, it's been absolutely critical in addressing that reality. I think it's also created some institutional space, whether that's the university or amongst churches and whatnot. I think of my neighbor, for example, who has embraced the term, a settler, non-Indigenous neighbor who's embraced the project and is trying to learn and work in solidarity with people in the community. So in that sense, it has opened up space, which I think, creates conditions that can develop stronger relations and a better consciousness of colonialism and whatnot, and the need to transcend it. However, from the perspective of the ruling class, I think it performs a function, a depoliticization function, you might say, in the sense that it draws people, I think, into a false unity and really eclipses the antagonism of the colonial relation between Indigenous nations and the settler state. And in doing so, I think it functions to really undermine the politics of national liberation. And in that sense, too, it also, as a correlation of that, really also depoliticizes capitalist society at the same time, and then kind of eternalizes that order. because not only is the colonial relation, the antagonism at the heart of it, lost in the ideology of reconciliation, but the structural antagonism between capital and labor doesn't even show up remotely. So in that sense, I think it performs a ruling class function to certainly depoliticize colonialism, the depth of it, and the structural nature of it. And I think, perhaps the number one problem for the ruling class, the political and capitalist class, is to really deal with the constitutional implications of Indigenous rights and whatnot around capitalist development. And in that sense, reconciliation, which I believe is really part of the broader politics of recognition that Coulthard theorizes, has really been an effort to secure the generalized conditions of capital accumulation, and above all, to do that by grounding Indigenous national, social, and cultural development on the premises of capital expansion and accumulation. So in that sense, I think reconciliation is something that inhibits the movement and the struggle for justice in any substantial sense.
A term that comes to mind when I think about this is the quest for certainty on the part of corporations and governments, right? That they want to know what the rules are that they can actually pursue, development projects, make profits in the context of the legal framework of Indigenous rights. And so the constant worry that there'll be uncertainty about their future profits,
absolutely.
their obligations.
Yeah, we see that especially with the Trans Mountain Pipeline, which has cost, over 30 billion or something. And I think Indigenous resistance has had something to do with that.
And then to shift a little bit, I mean, when you think about officials of the Assembly of First Nations and other organizations that are part of the band council system established under the Indian Act, how do you see the embrace of the ideas around reconciliation by that layer of people?
Yeah. Well, I mean, on the one hand, those institutions historically were created precisely actually, it's not so self-evident, but on the one hand, to create capacity within the state to advocate for Indigenous rights. But on the other hand, they've always been caught up in a counter struggle, which has sought to use them to channel the Indigenous movement in a certain direction. So I'm not one to say that they're inherently this or inherently that, but they've clearly played, certainly in recent years, I would say a function of normalizing precisely the situation that I described, marginalizing the more radical wing of the Indigenous movement and trying to ensure that, decolonization is more about closing the gap between Indigenous peoples and so-called regular Canadians than it is about, certainly national liberation and transforming a colonial relation that would open up space for a different type of social order. So in that sense, I see the embrace of those organizations, which to me are elements of the state, that are not free of tension, but nonetheless secure the general parameters of settler colonial capitalist society. And I mean, if you look at the history of the Indigenous struggle, certainly over the last 70 years or so, they have played, i.e., formal Indigenous organizations have played a key role in marginalizing the radical elements of the movement, self-activity and grassroots self-organization that is sought to address Indigenous needs and rights, in manners that, did not abide by settler law or the dominant political process, precisely because the terms on which the relation was to be negotiated and reformed excluded, basic premises that many in the Indigenous movement would not accept. So reconciliation, I see kind of, again, is a way of channeling the movement in a direction that marginalizes important developments within the radical anti-colonial struggle.
Right. So perhaps we could move on and think about something a little different but connected. And I'm thinking about here, there's a reality, of course, that the terrible suffering inflicted on Indigenous children in residential schools is now widely known. It's taught in schools. We have National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, or Orange Shirt Day, on September the 30th. And of course, there is a really vile right-wing trend that is engaged in denying or minimizing the suffering, and we need to challenge that trend and take it on. But fortunately, it's still pretty marginal. But at the same time, then the way that the history of residential schools is often taught, I think, is pretty revealing about the limits of the ideology of reconciliation. So if residential schools are not recognized as one facet of the oppression of Indigenous peoples rooted in their dispossession from the land, understanding that in a broad sense, then I think it's easy for people to think about that oppression as something that's just really from the past, and it has some kind of a malign legacy in the present today, and rather than thinking about this oppression as an ongoing reality. There's an anecdote which I'll just share here. Someone training to be a teacher who I know in Winnipeg recently told me about teaching high school students who all knew that residential schools were wrong, and they knew they were aimed at trying to assimilate people, but they had no explanation for why the government was trying to assimilate Indigenous youth through residential schools. So with all this in mind as kind of backdrop, can you talk about why you think the concept of settler colonialism is important?
Yeah. Well, again, right, what you were saying about residential schools, being abstracted from a much more comprehensive process, and then precisely because they're no longer colonial institutions in operation, that belongs to some, dark chapter of the past, like many have analyzed it. I mean, one of the things I think that is often missing in all of that discourse, of course, residential schools were absolutely critical in not only attacking Indigenous nations, undermining sovereignty, and dismantling Indigenous communities and culture and whatnot, but they also, and this might seem a little counterintuitive at first, but they're also creative institutions in the sense that they create conditions, i.e., the consolidation of capitalist society. Precisely by undermining a competing sovereignty and any kind of social practice that, could not be disciplined into the institution and generalization of the capitalist system. And of course, by situating them in that context, then we can understand residential schools, in a much broader process that is clearly ongoing. But in terms of settler colonialism, again, right, it's about grasping these institutions and practices within a broader logic and a broader social development. And again, colonialism cannot be reduced to residential schools on the one hand, or any number of institutions, but is really a much broader phenomenon. But there are many facets to it. I would say that on the one hand, there is the ongoing political domination of Indigenous nations, but on the other hand, you also have more complex phenomena like, say, the inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women called our attention to. Namely the genocide of that particular social position, and so that's really a mediated form that has a number of factors contributing to it. On the one hand, it's the racism and gender violence that exists in society. On the other hand, it's a form of structural abandonment and whatnot. Like if you think about the fact that people are trolling the Red River in Winnipeg and stuff because the police aren't doing that. So there's a number of factors, and I think that's all part of the comprehensive nature of settler colonialism. Of course, there's the effective control over Indigenous lands and the dispossession of Indigenous nations that correlates to that. But there's also, if we think about language and whatnot, right? The destruction of language, the repression of it, the utter lack of support in reconstituting these things that were heavily assaulted through those processes. All of this, I think, stabilizes, the colonial order. And yes, through a number of channels that are not just simply, reduced to any policy institution, and certainly none of the past. So I would say, bringing settler colonialism in as an important concept is, precisely to politicize the relation as it subsists currently.
And then this brings up the question, to maybe dig a little deeper into what we actually how we actually understand settler colonialism, because the term gets used by a wide range of people. And I think it's a good thing, broadly speaking, in a political sense. But there are different ways of thinking about it. Non-Marxist thinkers might use it in one way that would be different from the way those of us who are also Marxists would think about it. So can you share some thoughts about, how you think it's most often understood, and maybe contrast that with ways in which you think we should understand it?
Yeah, I would say, generally speaking, often, I mean, the way that it gets used in, say, Indigenous studies or a little more popularly, it often conflates the colonial relation for the social totality. And I
Can
think
you maybe unpack that a little bit for people when you say that?
Yeah. What I mean is it kind of represents society and kind of the fundamental conflict in society as if it's just simply between colonizer and colonized. And I think it loses that connection that I mentioned earlier, of its function in constituting and reproducing capitalist society, right? And, the way that many have theorized settler colonialism, it's, I think they've done a great job kind of illustrating the negative logic of it, right? Like how it's about eliminating Indigenous peoples, nations, political orders, legal orders, et cetera, et cetera. But to what end, right? As you were saying earlier, like when you spoke about the way that residential schools are taught, and students are kind of left with a question mark about, well, why was this just some perverse social experiment, a project in civilization or some other totally misleading ideological justification? I think that all kind of detracts and kind of obscures the fact that the negative logic of colonialism again is only makes sense in the constitution of a positive order, which to me is dominated by capital and its social relations, which of course colonial relations play a major role in that. So on the one hand, colonialism was certainly at the heart of creating capitalist society, but then the determinations of capital act back on colonial relations themselves, right, and give them a sense. So one of the ways I think when elimination, this logic of elimination is really just kind of portrayed in the abstract, and it suggests that it's total and whatnot. We miss the fact that logic of elimination conforms to the social necessity of capital, right? So, we can see that because with the struggle of Indigenous peoples and the inroads that people have made, well, clearly, there are concessions that are made and whatnot, but, the fundamental logic of colonialism and capitalism is still safeguarded through practices of colonial reform and the ideology of reconciliation. So clearly that, the elimination now, I think, it's not simply a blanket form of elimination, but it's the elimination of a certain form of Indigenous politics and whatnot, right? Clearly the more radical ones. So there are concessions. I mean, now if we think about the whole ideology of economic reconciliation, right, that has kind of filled the void of essentially the failure of the state to, carry out through, say, the land claims process and whatnot, this political certainty that you were talking, political and economic certainty. Because of the failure of that process now, we see that because capitalist development persists aggressively on Indigenous lands now, and Indigenous peoples have to be brought into the fold to an extent, there's all kinds of, negotiations around, how people can participate and get a slice of the economic pie. And, in that sense, Indigenous rights are recognized, but certainly not in the robust, substantial sense that I think the elements of the movement that I try and think through and empower are advocating for. Right. So on the one hand, that's what's lost, I think, in just thinking through everything in terms of settler colonialism. And also there's a constant disappointment and this, I think, false hope in the personnel of the ruling class. If only they understand the nature of the treaties, if only we have people who are educated enough to respect the implications of all this and not, lapse back into this colonial attitude and relation, then everything will work out. And I think that that's really misleading because, related to that is the fact that a lot of people thinking only in terms of settler colonialism have absolutely no theory of the capitalist state and its function in securing, generalized commodity production, both domestically and internationally, and what the structural imperatives associated with that. The limitations, imposed upon what kind of political decision making can take place, what kind of social development can take place, and so all of that, I think, which is enormous, is lost in a very simplified and abstract form of settler colonialism. And so, we have to recognize the value of that concept and what it does, because I think it's absolutely indispensable. On the other hand, it doesn't grasp the totality, of society, and therefore it has political implications that I think hinder, the struggle for justice around Indigenous rights and decolonization and whatnot.
So we'll certainly come back to that point before we finish. I want to just pick up on something that you touched on. Maybe we can focus on it, and that's about the ways that settler colonialism has and hasn't changed. Because I think it is really important to think about it historically, because if we're going to say settler colonialism exists today, it's also quite different on Turtle Island than it was, say, in the late 19th century, in the decades immediately after the formation of the modern Canadian state. So can you maybe draw out for listeners the ways in which you think, most important ways in which you think settler colonialism has changed, and what then has not changed?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think the main thing in answering that question is really what role has the Indigenous movement had in transforming the colonial relation, right? That we can't just think in terms of domination and the shifting faces of domination, but rather the coercive power of the movement to change the terms under which Indigenous peoples both live and through which colonial reform is achieved. So, if we go back in the first part of the 20th century, the colonial relation is incredibly totalitarian. Where Indigenous peoples are confined to reserves, where Indian agents essentially oversee everything. The bureaucracy pervades Indigenous life. If you read something like Harold Cardinal's *The Unjust Society*, which was published in the late 60s, you hear just the extent of this, right? And so that's a reality. And I mean, there's multiple facets to that. The extent of racism and social segregation that existed there, the extent to which the colonial relation was utterly depoliticized, right? Like that, where Indigenous rights were just unfathomable in that era and whatnot. And then so, when the 60s comes around, for a number of factors, you have, what I understand is kind of the emergence of a mass movement, thanks especially to the Black struggle that was raging in the U.S. and whatnot, and kind of the influences that crossed social struggles and whatnot. But anyways, the Red Power movement really develops out of that era. And if you read someone like Howard Adams, one of the things that he talks about is, sure, like the structure of colonialism persists, but what participation in those movements and engagement in direct action and the need to kind of take matters into their own hands did was, it really undermined the passivity. It built confidence among people. It really transformed their subjectivity, and they reclaimed a lot of their dignity in the process and made some inroads, right? Like they got the state, Indian agents off reserves. The church was, the influence of the church was more minimized, and and then there were certain gains in terms of infrastructure and, of course, self-administration, right? I think that this is really the reason I'm talking about this is really important, because I think a lot of people will say, well, like now people are just simply administering their own domination. And, that's true, right? Like, as I was saying earlier about formal organizations and their role within reconciliation and whatnot. That's true to an extent. But of course, there is a big difference between, the absolutely totalitarian oversight of one's life and controlling every decision, every move you make towards, a more flexible autonomy that has, I think, potential for other things, which is precisely what happened, right? So I just want to emphasize here, we can talk about how settler colonialism persists and Indigenous peoples are still dominated, absolutely. But I think the agency here is absolutely critical because it not only has it forced the state and the capitalist class to respond and to concede, but it has created different conditions that allow the struggle, have allowed the struggle to develop even further, which is what I try and take up in my own work. And reflecting on how that process of learning and transformation, led to a different form of strategic intervention to change things. Right now, it's an ongoing struggle, and the state and the capitalist class are extremely well organized, well resourced, and in my own work, clearly. Thinking through the struggle against capitalism is essential to getting beyond the colonial impasse. So lots of things have changed. I mean, we'd have to go in the details of that. But on the other hand, I'm not suggesting that everything simply progressed in a linear fashion, because I think that there are things we can learn from the 60s and mid 70s in terms of radical politics that in many ways are more advanced than where people are at in certain aspects, right? I also think that with the land back movement and the critique of recognition and reconciliation, and for example the Wet'suwet'en experience, where the slogan "reconciliation is dead" was quite pronounced and visible. There's a certain degree of irreversibility in the struggle, and I don't mean that like in some mystical sense. I just mean that there are certain terms like land back, for instance, and say the value importance of Indigenous law and knowledge and certain practices and institutions. These things are becoming more and more non-negotiable for people struggling for decolonization, meaning that they're no longer looking simply for concessions or a bigger piece of the economic pie, but are really not going back on these demands, even though I'm not naive, and there's a counter struggle that has in many ways effectively marginalized many radical elements in the movement. If we think about what's going on right now in Wet'suwet'en territory, we have essentially a branch of the RCMP that is virtually unaccountable, that is surveying the place and ensuring that not only that industry has access and whatnot, but that these developments don't have the power and potential to activate a mass struggle like they did in 2020. So I think dwelling in the tension of recognizing the agency of Indigenous peoples, the empowerment and the development of capacities and abilities to to struggle, and also recognizing kind of the ongoing structural nature of colonial capitalist society. I think that both of those and trying to think through the problem with both of those terms in mind is essential. To not lapsing into an obsession with domination that ultimately, I mean, ironically, those who only talk about domination and how the system works and how sophisticated it is and overwhelming it is, ironically, they kind of defer to the political status quo as the way out of the problem, because they've said nothing about the social forces that have evolved to bring us to where we are. And also, those that can be developed further to take on these problems and transcend these impasses.
People today often think about the relationship between different forms of oppression and capitalism as intersectional. So it's common for people, when they're thinking about capitalism and settler colonialism, to think about them as two intersecting systems. What do you think about that way of thinking about the relationship between capitalism and settler colonialism?
Yeah. I think I'd like to begin to answer that question by suggesting that, at least in the struggle against colonialism here, the separation of these social relations into distinct systems actually has a basis in the practice of settler colonial capitalist domination. So, for example, the process of colonial reform through land claims, or what is currently called economic reconciliation, where the economic implications of Indigenous constitutional rights are fulfilled without settling any major political issues around things like the ultimate authority or jurisdiction, things like that. These are practices that maintain, I think, or reestablish the separation of production and control while conceding kind of a relative measure of Indigenous political autonomy that remains subordinated to the settler state. So, in this sense, I think the colonial relation is reformed without politicizing the capital relation, at least insofar as that relation is understood as a relation of production, whereby the direct producers are separated from the material and means of production, and production and control are radically divorced, right, with capital assuming all controlling functions in the process of realizing labor. So, in this case, rather, only economic distribution, we might say, is politicized via the recognition of Indigenous political and legal rights. So what this effectively amounts to, I think, is that political and legal concessions facilitate the development of class relations internal to Indigenous communities and conditions for capitalist personification, if we're using Marx's language, among Indigenous governments and private economic actors, securing the social conditions wherein resources, both human and material, can only be mobilized according to the dictates and imperatives of capital expansion. Okay, so I think this is one major way in which these social relations are separated in practice as distinct systems, which are dialectically disassociated from each other, if you will, in the interests of sustaining colonial and capitalist domination. So I also think that theory then tends to internalize these kinds of practical separations and represent them as distinct systems as a result, which I think have tremendous political consequences. So, for instance, if we go back in the history of the Indigenous movement, Howard Adams, I think, leveled a very important critique in the early 90s at the politics of Indigenous representatives and organizations who were engaged in constitutional talks at the time. Which, according to him, was really a politics of nationalism that forged a false identity between Indigenous elites and working class folks through the categories of nation, race, ethnicity, and whatnot, while excluding and therefore, I think, suppressing all forms of class analysis and politicization of capital internal to Indigenous communities. So central to this politics, according to Adams, and I think this is relevant to the question of fighting separation in theory and practice, was that this identity between the elites and the broader community was forged through the alienation of grassroots politics, and above all, the self-activity and organization of the colonized in their effort to liberate themselves and develop their capacities for self-determination in the process. So the last point I think is key in terms of domination and liberation, namely the protagonism of the colonized in the process of struggle, right, which was central to Adams's notion of radical nationalism, which I believe is still extremely important today. For the fact that it's centered the struggle as a process of learning and transformation. And I'm going to tie this into the question in a moment. But accordingly, the fight for national liberation was grasped as a struggle for autonomy over social life, right? Whereby local struggles would have to progressively confront more complex determinations of the social totality as it advanced in the effort to realize the fundamental goals of Indigenous national liberation and self-determination. So in this sense, I think Adams understood class struggle as a concrete development of Indigenous nationalism, not in the sense of abandoning the politics of nationalism, right? But of carrying its logic to its full concrete development, which would inevitably involve confronting capital as central to the politics of national liberation. So the protagonism at the heart of the self-liberation of the colonized was for him, and I agree wholeheartedly with this, the process through which the social relations of colonialism and capitalism, if you will, are reunified, which are otherwise separated as a function and condition of domination. Okay, so in my work, I've followed a similar path and developed the concept of dual dispossession as a means of combating this separation in theory and practice, of settler colonialism and capitalism. So dual dispossession is a concept that recognizes the co-determination of Indigenous experience, both of domination and struggle, characterized by colonial dispossession and domination and capitalist separation of the direct producers from the means of production. So both of these relations are shaping Indigenous experience. Importantly, though, the concept is one that I developed and emerges through the frontline struggles of Indigenous land defenders and water protectors, and demonstrates the practical inseparability of these social relations. Okay, so what I mean is that, at least in my analysis, what I took from it is that in order to resist unwanted colonial capitalist incursions into Indigenous territories and lands, say if we think of Wet'suwet'en in 2020 or Standing Rock in 2016, so to resist that and to exercise Indigenous sovereignty and enforce Indigenous law, the front lines are organized through a redistribution of human and material resources that functions to mitigate the mute compulsions of economic relations, which Marx talked about, and thereby sustain the full-time presence of land defenders and water protectors on the front lines. So there's more to the story than this, of course, but I just bring it up here because, in other words, it means that the conditions of effectively confronting colonial incursion depends upon a strategic intervention into the relations of capitalist production, even if this only means to evade their direct constraints and not confront them directly. So this autonomization of the front lines, I think, has been critical also for activating mass solidarity and disrupting capital at the point of circulation, as we saw in 2020, as a means to substantiate the power of Indigenous self-determination, even if it was ultimately defeated. So in practice, the main point here is that in the practice of radical frontline anti-colonialism, there is a necessity to deal with these social relations in a unified manner, and dual dispossession corresponds to that unity in theory, with the aim of pushing the struggle against these comprehensive social relations further. So that's how I would answer that, through the experience of my work and what I think are important developments within the Indigenous struggle and anti-colonialism more broadly.
Yeah, I think that's very helpful. And it takes us to the final question, which is a very big question. And, if we think about the ways that settler colonialism and capitalism are inextricably interwoven, right? That has really big implications for how we think about social struggles on Turtle Island. Both their implications for Indigenous people, but I think there are also really important implications for the non-Indigenous working class. So I'm really interested to know what you would, to start off, what your thoughts would be in terms of, the implications for the Indigenous struggle, which, as you were just talking about, is a national liberation struggle, an anti-colonial struggle. If it's a struggle that's simultaneously going to be against settler colonialism and capitalism, like what are the big political implications of that?
Yeah, that is a huge question. So critical to this question for me, I think, above all, is grasping, the radical tendencies within the history of the Indigenous movement as really a struggle to exercise Indigenous self-determination beyond capital, and not as a form of subordinated or relegated autonomy under the rule of it and the settler state. So with the historical development of the radical Indigenous movement, the politics of Indigenous national liberation have become progressively based on developing the power of Indigenous governance, grounded upon Indigenous laws, as well as traditional knowledge and institutions to determine social practice and its substantive regulation. So this is what I take to mean, at least, this is what I take Indigenous resurgence, for example, to mean. So in light of this, right? If this is part of what those radical politics entail and how they've been developing, the objective basis of capital is not only a highly contradictory one, but an inherently antagonistic one, whose conditions and imperatives, I think, structurally subordinate these indigenous sources of social determination to mere contingencies and peripheral considerations in principle. So developing and liberating the substantial social power of Indigenous self-determination, I think, cannot be about simply trying to evade capital's more immediate compulsions or whatever, but requires breaking the rule of capital as a historical paradigm of social production. So if I can return to my analysis of of the front lines of radical anti-colonialism, this means that I think as sites of practice and struggle, which are not self-sufficient, right, and depend on a redistribution of wealth originating in the circuits of capital, these struggles remain marginal and therefore have to turn to challenging capital as a relation of production and not merely disrupting the circulation of capital as a means of leveraging Indigenous rights, even though I think it's about evolving that practice and not simply trumping one strategy with another. But this entails, and this is how it relates, I think, that recognizing precisely because labor is a universal condition of humanity and cannot be avoided, it represents the crux in the process of restructuring the social metabolism, like in the most comprehensive sense, and establishing a coherent alternative of societal reproduction to capital. And for this reason, despite whatever major obstacles to this consciousness and its corresponding strategies that may exist, the practice of Indigenous self-determination beyond capital is intrinsically related to the liberation and self-determination of the working class in general. And I think this represents the only comprehensive horizon of social struggle and experimentation in which it can develop. So in practice, I think this would involve, as a critical step, fostering the solidarity that we saw in 2020 in a way that could activate the power of labor to also disrupt capital at the point of production, right, as a means of anti-colonial power. But in order to move beyond a defensive strategy, I think, in the face of the state and capital, the massive process of restructuring the social metabolism, which I believe, belongs to the essence of the Indigenous struggle, also has to be undertaken. And this involves not merely the instrumental support of the working class, but seeing its liberation as an essential premise of the Indigenous struggle itself. So that's one way of thinking in general terms, at least, in grasping this kind of as a general form of orientation. And from the other, or to address the other part of your question concerning the implications for the non-Indigenous working class. Well, I would say, for one, if socialism is about struggling for and establishing a radical form of mutual self and collective development, right, that reaches all aspects of social life, including the conditions of existence and the social relations of production that sustain and foster them, in a way that is radically open, historically speaking, then what I call the constitutional violence of settler colonialism, which I'll explain in a second, needs to be actively fought against, and the revitalization, I think, of Indigenous knowledge and practices in a critical way must be facilitated. So that the constitutional violence of settler colonialism, I think, has to do with the fact that capitalist society was created and is reproduced by the elimination of competing sovereignties, the destruction and what some call epistemicide of Indigenous language, norms and institutions, the violent targeting of Indigenous women, and the perverse overturning of radically open gender norms and different forms of sexuality, and many other forms of violence. Settler colonialism, as I understand it, is intrinsically about forging a society through the destruction or radical suppression of others. And that's why I think co-fostering and revitalizing many of these social practices is critical to suppressing the logic of settler colonialism and creating the kind of social relations and people that the positive project of a radically open and decolonized socialist society demands. So that's how I would, offer a general reason, and, an implication for the non-Indigenous working class. But of course, then comes the challenging work, right, of fostering those relations. But I guess part of the challenge, at least theoretically, is to recognize the internal relation between these struggles and the necessity of each to the development of both of their overall political goals.
Right. So that the liberation of Indigenous people from settler colonialism and the liberation of the working class from capitalism are fundamentally inseparable, but they can't be reduced to each other.
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely. And I think recognizing that and then engaging and developing the strategies that foster that insight are really what takes us into a realm of struggle and social experimentation, that can create the conditions for the type of society we'd like to see, which supplants both the colonial and capital relation.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, miigwech for having me, David. It's really great to be on.
That's it for this episode of Victor's Children. I'd like to thank Jonathan Croker, the producer of Victor's Children, without whom the podcast wouldn't be possible. I'd also like to thank Posey Legg, who designed the graphic for Victor's Children. If you found the episode worth listening to, please do tell other people about the show, since word-of-mouth recommendations are especially helpful. If you don't subscribe through your preferred podcast app, please do. And while you're there, please give the show a high rating. It helps to promote us. If you have a suggestion for an episode or some other kind of constructive feedback, feel free to be in touch with me. You can contact me through victorschildren@gmail.com.